I'm Dr. Catherine Bennett, a trauma surgeon who once believed life was nothing more than science and survival. I prided myself on saving lives, never stopping to think about my own soul until the day I died. For 3 minutes, my heart stopped, and I was pulled into a realm that shattered everything I thought I knew about life, death, and God. What I saw, what I felt, it wasn't just a near death experience, it was a reckoning. And when I woke up, I knew I could never be the same. The crash wasn't supposed to happen. I was heading home after another grueling 16-hour shift at the hospital, replaying the surgery I'd just performed on a boy whose face I couldn't even remember. My life was a blur of split-second decisions, adrenaline, and the comforting hum of monitors. Work had always been my sanctuary. Then, out of nowhere, headlights, a scream, the crunch of metal, and silence. I opened my eyes to an eerie stillness. I was standing, somehow unscathed, in the middle of my childhood street. It was my neighborhood, yet it wasn't. The air felt thick, as if it carried more weight than it should. Familiar houses lined the street, but their edges rippled, warped, as if reality itself were unsure of its form. The sky above wasn't dark, yet there was no sun, only a dull, golden glow that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, I thought it was some bizarre dream, a trick of my mind coping with the trauma. But the details were too sharp, too vivid. I could smell the damp earth beneath my feet, feel the uneven cracks in the pavement, and hear a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air. Then I noticed the silence, no birds, no distant traffic, not even the sound of my own breath. Catherine Bennett. The voice startled me, deep and resonant, yet calm. I turned and saw a figure approaching, cloaked in robes that shifted with the golden light. I couldn't make out a face, just a vague outline beneath a hood. Despite the figure's peaceful tone, dread settled in my chest. "Where am I?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stopped a few feet from me. "Not where. You should ask why." "Why?" I repeated, almost scoffing. "I just crashed my car. Am I dreaming? Did I hit my head?" "You are neither dreaming nor awake," the figure replied. "You are in a place between, a reflection of your life, shaped by the choices you've made." I opened my mouth to argue, to demand answers, but something about the figure's presence silenced me. The golden light around us dimmed slightly, and the hum grew louder, almost like a warning. "You've lived a life of skill, of control," the figure continued. "But control is an illusion, Catherine. You've placed faith in yourself above all else. Is that supposed to be a bad thing?" I shot back. "I've saved lives. I've worked harder than anyone I know. If you're here to judge me, maybe you should consider that." The figure raised a hand, and the world around us began to shift. The streets stretched endlessly in both directions, houses melting into hazy outlines. I stumbled backward, disoriented, as the ground beneath my feet cracked and splintered. "Your actions speak," the figure said, their voice growing sharper. "But so do the intentions behind them. Watch." Suddenly, I was inside a church, though not one I recognized. The walls were stained with shadows, and the pews were filled with figures, their heads bowed in silent prayer. As I moved closer, I saw that their lips moved, but no sound escaped. Ashes fell from their mouths, piling at their feet. I turned to the figure. "What is this?" "This is the weight of empty words," they replied. "Promises unkept. Forgiveness withheld. Faith feigned. Do you recognize it?" I shook my head, but the figure's words stirred something inside me, a memory I didn't want to acknowledge. My mother, sitting at our kitchen table years ago, crying as she begged me to go to church with her just once. I had refused, brushing her off with a dismissive, "I'm too busy saving lives to waste time on fairy tales." She had died a year later, and I hadn't thought about that conversation since. "I don't belong here," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "I've done good in the world. I've helped people." The figure stepped closer, and the pews dissolved into darkness. Goodness without humility is a fragile thing. You do not see the full measure of your choices. Not yet. Before I could respond, the world shifted again. Now I was standing in a hospital, my hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of antiseptic. I recognized the hallway instantly. I had walked it thousands of times. A gurney rolled past me, pushed by nurses who didn't seem to notice my presence. On it lay a young boy, his face pale and lifeless. My heart sank. I remembered him, Alex, an 8-year-old with severe internal bleeding after a bike accident. I had fought to save him, but his injuries were too severe. He died, I whispered, my voice breaking. I couldn't save him. The figure appeared beside me. Do you remember how you treated his parents? The scene shifted, and I saw myself standing in the same hallway, my scrubs stained with blood. Alex's parents were sobbing in front of me, begging for answers. I watched myself speak to them with cold detachment, rattling off medical jargon and statistics instead of offering comfort. I had justified it at the time. There was no point sugarcoating the truth. But now, seeing it from this perspective, my callousness was undeniable. I didn't mean to. I started, but the figure cut me off. You didn't mean to, but you did. And it is not the only time. The hospital around us flickered like a dying bulb, and more faces appeared, patients I had dismissed, nurses I had snapped at, colleagues I had undermined. Each interaction flashed before me, leaving behind a bitter taste in my mouth. My stomach churned as I realized how many lives I had touched in ways I never considered. Stop, I begged. Please, I understand. Do you? The figure's tone softened, but their presence felt heavier now, like a weight pressing down on my chest. There is more to see, Catherine, but the choice is yours. Will you walk the narrow path, or remain in the shadows of your pride? I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My throat was dry, and my thoughts were spinning. The golden light began to fade, replaced by an encroaching darkness that sent shivers down my spine. I felt the ground shift beneath me again, and this time I was falling into the unknown. I hit the ground hard, but there was no pain, just a jarring thud that sent a shiver through my entire body. When I opened my eyes, I was standing again, though the air felt heavier, colder. I was inside what looked like a church, but not the one from before. This place was rotting, its walls covered in creeping vines that pulsed like veins. The stained glass windows were shattered, letting in beams of faint, sickly light. The pews were empty, but the oppressive silence hung in the air like a weight. I turned, expecting the cloaked figure to be there, but I was alone. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly vulnerable. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. Only the silence answered. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my footsteps echoing on the cracked stone floor. At the front of the church, the altar was draped with a tattered cloth, and behind it stood a massive wooden cross, splintered and leaning as though it could collapse at any moment. The scene felt wrong, twisted, as though I had stepped into a place that once held something sacred but had long since been abandoned. As I approached the altar, I saw something glinting on the ground. It was a mirror, small and circular, framed in tarnished silver. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, but my curiosity won out. I knelt and picked it up. The glass was cracked, and at first, all I could see was my distorted reflection staring back at me. Then the image shifted. I saw myself standing in an operating room, shouting orders as a team worked frantically around me. The patient on the table was a woman, her face pale and lifeless, her body limp. I recognized her immediately. It was Mrs. Daniels, a patient who had come in after a routine surgery went horribly wrong. I had done everything I could, but we'd lost her on the table. The scene in the mirror zoomed in, showing me walking out of the OR. Mrs. Daniels' husband was in the waiting room, pacing nervously. I remembered this moment vividly. I had been exhausted, frustrated. I told him what had happened with a detached bluntness that left him stunned, his grief-stricken face etched in my memory. He had thanked me for trying, but the look in his eyes haunted me for weeks. As I watched, the mirror showed him sitting in the same waiting room hours later, his head in his hands. He was whispering something, a prayer maybe, but I couldn't hear the words. Then the image changed again. He was at home, alone, staring at a photo of his wife with tears streaming down his face. A bottle of pills sat on the table in front of him, and I watched in horror as he reached for it. No, I whispered, dropping the mirror as though it had burned me. The glass shattered on the floor, and the sound echoed through the empty church. I stood frozen, my chest tight, my heart pounding. I hadn't thought about Mr. Daniels in years. I had convinced myself I had done all I could, that his grief wasn't my responsibility. But seeing it now, seeing the ripple effects of my actions, made me feel like I was drowning. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see the cloaked figure standing at the end of the aisle, their hood pulled low over their face. "Do you see now?" they asked, their voice resonating through the church like a distant storm. "I didn't mean for that to happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," the figure repeated, their tone sharp. "You've used those words to justify much. But a job is not an excuse for apathy, Catherine. You saw his pain and turned away." "I didn't know," I started, but the figure interrupted. "You didn't care to know." They raised a hand, and the room shifted around us. The church dissolved, replaced by the sterile white walls of a hospital hallway. I recognized it immediately. This was my hospital. Nurses and doctors bustled past me, their movements hurried but purposeful. I stood in the middle of the hallway, feeling strangely invisible as people brushed past without acknowledging me. I followed the figure as they walked ahead, their robes gliding silently over the polished floor. They stopped outside a room, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated, but the figure's silent gaze was unrelenting. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single hospital bed. Lying in it was an elderly woman, frail and hooked up to a tangle of machines. I recognized her instantly, Mrs. Callahan, one of my regular patients. She had been a kind woman, always thanking me profusely for my care, even when I didn't feel I had done much to deserve it. She had died under my watch a year ago, another case of nothing more we could do. As I approached her bed, the machines began to beep softly, a slow, steady rhythm. Then I heard her voice, soft but clear. "You never saw me." I froze, staring at her lifeless form. "What?" "You never saw me," she repeated, her voice reverberating through the room. "I wasn't just another case. I wasn't just another name on your rounds. I was someone, but you never saw that." "I did my best," I argued, though my words felt hollow. "Did you?" Her voice was growing louder now, accusing. "You gave me medicine, but you never gave me hope. You treated my body, but you ignored my soul." The machines began to beat faster, their rhythm chaotic and unsettling. The air in the room grew thick, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening. "Stop," I whispered, clutching at my head. "Please stop." The room dissolved around me, and I was back in the hallway. The figure stood silently beside me, their presence heavy and suffocating. "Do you understand now?" they asked. I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling, my heart pounding. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew they were right. I had spent my life hiding behind my job, convincing myself that my technical skills and intellect were enough. But they weren't. I had failed to see the humanity in the people I treated, and now I was being forced to face the consequences. The figure turned and began walking down the hallway, their movements slow and deliberate. I followed, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't know where they were taking me, but I had no choice. Something told me this was only the beginning. The hallway stretched on forever. No matter how far I walked, the doors on either side seemed to repeat themselves, like a looping dream I couldn't escape. My legs ached, my breaths came shallow, but the cloaked figure ahead of me never slowed. The hum in the air had grown louder, more insistent, like a drumbeat urging me forward. I didn't dare stop, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But there was no back, not anymore. Finally, the figure paused at the end of the hallway, where a large, ornate mirror hung on the wall. Its surface was so polished it seemed almost liquid, rippling as though stirred by some unseen force. I approached cautiously, my reflection staring back at me. But there was something off. My face was hollow, my eyes dull, as if the life had been drained out of me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Truth," the figure replied simply. They gestured to the mirror, and as I looked closer, my reflection began to shift. It was still me, but not me. This version of myself was glowing, radiant, her face soft and serene. Her eyes held a peace I couldn't comprehend, a kind of fulfillment I had never known. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the surface, but it rippled and dissolved, leaving nothing but darkness behind the glass. "Who was that?" I whispered, my throat tight. "That is who you could have been," the figure said. "If you had lived with humility, if you had sought to serve rather than control, if you had placed your faith in something greater than yourself." I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I've done everything right. I've worked hard, helped people. I've made something of myself." The figures had tilted slightly, as if in pity. "And yet, you feel empty. Why is that, Catherine?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew they were right. Despite all my accomplishments, despite the lives I had saved, there was always a void, a gnawing feeling that nothing was ever enough. But I wasn't about to admit that, not here, not to them. "Show me the rest," I demanded, my voice shaking. "If you're going to judge me, then show me everything." The figure raised their hand, and the mirror rippled again. This time, the image that appeared made my stomach turn. It was still me, but now I was hunched and twisted, my skin gray and wrinkled, my eyes hollow and lifeless. This version of myself was surrounded by shadows that clung to her like a second skin. She reached out toward me, her gnarled hands clawing at the glass, her face contorted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, that's not me. That can't be me. That is who you are becoming," the figure said, their voice heavier now, almost sorrowful. "Your pride, your apathy, your unwillingness to see beyond yourself. This is their fruit." "No," I shouted, my voice echoing through the endless hallway. "I'm not like that. I'm not. I'm not a bad person." The figure stepped closer, their presence overwhelming. "Goodness without humility is empty. You have spent your life trying to control everything, believing you alone were enough. But control is a lie, Catherine. Only surrender brings true peace." I shook my head violently, my hands clenching into fists. Surrender to what? To some invisible force? To a God who lets people die? I've seen too much pain, too much suffering. If there's a God, he doesn't care. The figure was silent for a long moment. Then they gestured toward the mirror again. This time, it showed a memory, one I had tried to bury. I was 8 years old, sitting in a pew beside my mother. The church was small and unremarkable, but my mother's voice filled it as she sang hymns with a joy I didn't understand. She had always been so certain, so steadfast in her faith. I had admired it once, long ago, before I decided it was foolish. The memory shifted, and now I saw her at our kitchen table years later, her hands clasped in prayer. She was praying for me. I recognized the look on her face, the mixture of hope and sorrow. She had begged me to join her, to give faith a chance, but I had refused, mocking her beliefs as childish. She had never argued, only smiled sadly and said, "One day, you'll understand." I swallowed hard, the weight of the memory pressing down on me. She was wrong, I said, though my voice was barely a whisper. "Was she?" the figure asked, their tone gentle but firm. "You have tried to fill the void in your soul with success, with control, with pride. But none of it has satisfied you. Why is that, Catherine?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The mirror dissolved again, leaving nothing but my own hollow reflection staring back at me. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through my entire body, and I felt the ground beneath me begin to shake. "Enough," I said, my voice breaking. I don't want to see anymore. The figure stepped back, their presence less oppressive now. There is more to see, Catherine, but the choice is yours. Will you continue, or will you turn away? I looked at the mirror, at the endless hallway stretching out before me, at the figure who seemed to know me better than I knew myself. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare and go back to the life I knew. But something inside me, something small and fragile, whispered that there was no going back. Not really. Show me, I said finally, my voice barely audible. Show me everything. The figure nodded, and the hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. The hallway began to dissolve around us, the walls melting into darkness. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever came next. The darkness was complete. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was oppressive, suffocating, pressing against my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe. I stumbled forward, reaching out for something, anything, to ground me. My fingers brushed against nothingness, the void stretching endlessly in every direction. I was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. Then came the voices. They started as faint whispers, distant and unintelligible, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded me. It was a cacophony of anguish, screams, sobs, desperate pleas that echoed endlessly in the blackness. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside me, reverberating in my head, filling every corner of my mind. You didn't care. You never listened. You left us behind. Each accusation felt like a dagger, sharp and unrelenting. I wanted to scream back, to deny their words, but the truth of them was undeniable. These were the voices of my past, the people I had hurt, the lives I had touched without thought, the echoes of my failures. Their pain wrapped around me like chains, dragging me down, deeper into the void. I don't know how long I wandered in that darkness, weighed down by the voices. Time felt meaningless here. My feet dragged across an invisible surface, my breath shallow and labored. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was small, barely more than a spark, but it was enough to pull me forward. I stumbled toward it, desperation driving me. As I got closer, the light grew until I could see it was a single flame, hovering in the air like a fragile ember. Beneath it stood a figure, and my heart clenched as I recognized him. Eli, I whispered. My brother stood there, bathed in the light of the flame. He looked younger than I remembered, his face free of the lines and shadows that addiction had etched into it. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. Catherine, he said, his voice soft but firm. I've been waiting. Tears welled in my eyes as I took a shaky step toward him. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, he interrupted, his tone cutting but not cruel. You turned away, Catherine, just like everyone else. I froze, his words hitting me like a blow. That's not fair, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I try to help you. I did everything I could. Eli shook his head slowly. No, you judged me. You decided I wasn't worth saving. You left me to drown in my own darkness because it was easier than reaching out. My chest tightened, and I struggled to find the words to defend myself. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had told myself I was helping him by being firm, by not enabling him. But the truth was, I had given up on him long before he died. I didn't know how to help you, I said finally, my voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. You didn't have to do anything, Eli said, stepping closer. You just had to see me, really see me. But you couldn't because you were too busy looking at yourself. His words cut deeper than anything I had faced so far. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I sank to my knees. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Eli. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, to my surprise, Eli knelt beside me. He reached out, his hand warm against my shoulder. I forgive you, he said softly, but it's not me you need to ask. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. Then who? Eli didn't answer. Instead, he stood and stepped back into the shadows, the light of the flame fading with him. I reached out, desperate to hold on to him, but he was gone, leaving me alone once more. The darkness pressed in again, but this time it was different. The voices were quieter, their accusations softer, almost as if they were waiting. I sat there, trembling, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, replaying every moment of my life, every mistake, every missed opportunity. The weight of it all was crushing. Then, out of the silence, a new voice spoke. Catherine. It wasn't like the others. This voice was calm, steady, filled with an authority that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned toward it, and there, in the distance, I saw another light. This one was brighter, warmer, pulsing with an energy that called to me. I hesitated, fear warring with curiosity. But something inside me, something small and fragile, urged me forward. As I approached the light, I saw a figure standing within it. They were cloaked in radiant white, their face obscured by the brilliance of the light. But I didn't need to see their face to know who they were. My heart knew. My soul knew. Why are you here? I asked, my voice trembling. To show you the truth, the figure replied. What truth? I demanded, though my voice was barely above a whisper. That I'm a terrible person? That I've failed everyone I've ever cared about? I already know that. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they raised a hand, and the light around them grew brighter. Images began to form within it, scenes from my life. I saw myself as a child, sitting beside my mother as she prayed. I saw myself in medical school, driven and determined but distant from the people around me. I saw myself in the hospital, working tirelessly but never connecting with the lives I was trying to save. You've spent your life running, the figure said, their voice gentle but firm. Running from pain, from vulnerability, from the truth of who you are. You have built walls around your heart, believing they would protect you. But those walls have only imprisoned you. Tears streamed down my face as the images continued to play, each one a reminder of the life I had lived, the choices I had made. I don't know how to fix it, I whispered. I don't know how to change. The figure stepped closer, their presence overwhelming but not oppressive. You don't have to fix it, Catherine. You only have to surrender. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I stared at the figure, my mind racing. Surrender. The very idea terrified me. I had spent my entire life holding on, controlling everything I could, refusing to let go. But now, faced with the weight of my own failures, I realized I couldn't hold on any longer. I don't know how. I admit it, my voice breaking. I don't know how to let go. The figure reached out, their hand glowing with warmth. Ask, they said simply. I hesitated, fear and doubt warring within me. But then I remembered Eli's words, the look in his eyes as he forgave me. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and took the figure's hand. The light engulfed me, and everything else faded away. The light enveloped me completely, warm and all-consuming. I expected pain or terror, but instead, I felt weightless, as though the burden I had carried for so long had been lifted, even if only for a moment. When the light receded, I found myself standing in a vast, open expanse. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, endless, glowing with a radiance that seemed to come from within the very air itself. It was neither day nor night, but something eternal, timeless. In front of me stood a massive archway, impossibly intricate and shimmering as if it were alive. Beyond it, I could see nothing but an overwhelming brilliance, too pure to look at directly. Standing at the base of the archway was a figure, different from the cloaked guide who had led me this far. This figure radiated authority, power, and an indescribable sense of presence. I couldn't see their face clearly, only the faint outline of a crown of light encircling their head. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no doubt in my mind who this was. I had doubted his existence my entire life, scoffed at the idea of his presence, but standing here now, every fiber of my being knew the truth. This was Christ. He raised his hand, beckoning me forward. My legs felt heavy, almost like they were refusing to obey, but somehow I moved. Each step felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff, the weight of my life pressing down on me with every inch closer. When I reached him, I stopped, unable to meet his gaze. "Catherine," he said, and his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't loud, but it resonated through me, shaking something deep inside. It was both gentle and commanding, loving and piercing. "Do you know why you are here?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I think so," I whispered, though my voice felt small and insignificant. "To see, to understand." "To see yourself," he corrected, "as you are meant to be, and to choose." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt exposed, as though every thought, every secret, every sin I had ever tried to bury was laid bare before him. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to run, though I knew there was nowhere to go. With a wave of his hand, the space around us shifted. Suddenly, we were standing in what looked like a courtroom. The archway was gone, replaced by towering walls that stretched into infinity. In the center of the room was a large, ornate table, and on it sat an open book. Its pages glowed faintly, and I felt a strange pull toward it. "This is the record of your life," Christ said, gesturing to the book. "Every thought, every word, every deed." I stared at it, my heart pounding. The idea of someone knowing every detail of my life was terrifying enough, but to see it laid out like this, I wasn't sure I could handle it. "Come," he said, motioning for me to approach the table. Reluctantly, I stepped forward. As I neared the book, the pages began to turn on their own, stopping on a section filled with glowing text. The words seemed to rise off the page, forming images in the air. I watched as scenes from my life played out before me, moments I had long forgotten, moments I had tried to forget. I saw myself as a young girl, lashing out at my mother during an argument. She had been trying to comfort me after I failed a test, but I had screamed at her, blaming her for my own shortcomings. I saw myself in college, gossiping about a classmate to gain favor with a professor. I saw countless moments in the hospital where I had dismissed patients, snapped at nurses, and treated people as tasks to complete rather than souls in need. Tears streamed down my face as the scenes continued to unfold. Each one was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of every time I had failed, every time I had chosen pride over humility, selfishness over kindness. "I thought I was doing good," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I thought I was helping." "Your actions were not always wrong," Christ said, his tone gentle but firm. "But your heart was far from me. You relied on yourself, your knowledge, your strength. You did not seek me." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had spent my entire life building walls, convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, least of all God. And now, standing here, I saw the cost of that choice. The scenes shifted again, this time showing moments I didn't recognize. These were the ripple effects of my actions, the times I had hurt people without realizing it, the opportunities one had missed to show kindness or grace. I saw Mr. Daniels, the man whose wife I had lost on the operating table, sitting alone in his home, consumed by grief. I saw a nurse I had scolded crying in the break room, doubting her abilities because of my harsh words. I saw a young patient, a teenager, who had looked up to me but had been crushed by my cold demeanor. I fell to my knees, unable to bear the weight of it. "I didn't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't see." "But now you do," Christ said, kneeling beside me. His presence was overwhelming, but not oppressive. It was as though he carried both my pain and his love for me in equal measure. "And now you must choose." I looked up at him, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. "Choose what?" "To let go," he said simply. "To surrender your pride, your control, your need to do everything on your own." to accept my grace and live in my light. The words terrified me. Surrender, grace. They were concepts I had always dismissed, always seen as weakness. But now, faced with the truth of my life, I realized that holding on to my pride had only brought me emptiness and pain. I don't know how. I admit it, tears streaming down my face. I don't know how to let go. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice soft but unyielding. Just take the first step. For a long moment, I hesitated. The weight of my past pressed down on me, the fear of the unknown threatening to crush me. But then I remembered the warmth of Eli's forgiveness, the light in his eyes as he told me to seek something greater. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes and whispered, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please help me. The moment the words left my lips, the courtroom dissolved into light. It wasn't blinding or harsh. It was warm, soothing, filling every corner of my being. I felt the chains of my guilt and fear breaking away, replaced by a peace I had never known. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the archway, the light beyond it brighter than ever. Christ stood beside me, his expression filled with a love that brought fresh tears to my eyes. Go, he said, gesturing toward the light, and live as you were meant to. I stepped forward, the warmth of the light pulling me closer. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. I woke to the sterile beeping of a heart monitor. The smell of antiseptic filled my nose, and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead burned my eyes. At first, I didn't know where I was or even who I was. Everything felt distant, as though I were caught between two realities. Then the pain hit, sharp and searing, pulling me fully into my body. I was alive. Blinking through tears, I turned my head and saw my daughter, Hannah, sitting by my bedside. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from crying. When she saw I was awake, her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a gasp. Mom, she whispered, leaning forward to take my hand. Her grip was warm and steady, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. You're awake. Her voice broke something inside me. Tears streamed down my face as I squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by everything I had seen, everything I had felt. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, choked by the flood of emotions I couldn't yet process. It's okay, she said, her voice soothing. You're okay. No, I wasn't okay. I had died. I had stood in the presence of Christ, had my soul laid bare, and been given another chance, a gift I knew I didn't deserve. The weight of it was staggering. My chest heaved as sobs overtook me, and Hannah leaned closer, her arms wrapping around me carefully, mindful of the tubes and wires that tethered me to life. For the first time in years, I let myself feel everything, the pain, the regret, the overwhelming gratitude. And for the first time, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to let someone see me as I truly was, broken but alive. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. Doctors came and went, their voices a mix of clinical detachment and cautious optimism. They marveled at how I had survived such a catastrophic crash, how my heart had stopped for nearly 3 minutes, yet left no lasting damage. It's a miracle, one of them said, shaking his head in disbelief. I only nodded, unable to find the words to explain just how right he was. Hannah stayed by my side through it all, her quiet presence a constant comfort. I watched her as she fussed over me, arranging flowers on the windowsill, bringing me cups of tea, and sitting with me during the long, sleepless nights. For years, I had pushed her away, too consumed by my work to notice how much she needed me, or how much I needed her. But now, seeing her devotion, her love, I realized how much I had taken for granted. One evening, as the sun set outside my hospital window, painting the room in soft hues of orange and pink, I turned to her. Hannah, I said, my voice rasping from disuse. I'm sorry. She looked up from her book, her brows knitting together. For what? For everything, I said, tears pooling in my eyes. For not being there for you. For putting my work above you. For not seeing you. Her expression softened, and she reached for my hand. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I interrupted, squeezing her hand tightly. I need you to know how sorry I am. I've made so many mistakes, Hannah, but I promise I'm going to make it right. Her lips trembled, and she nodded, her own tears spilling over. I missed you, she whispered. I just, I've missed you so much. I pulled her into a careful embrace, holding her as tightly as my weak arms would allow. I'm here, I said. I'm here now. The next few weeks were a time of quiet reflection and healing. As my body regained strength, so did my spirit. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, the truth that had been revealed to me. It was as if my life had been split in two, the person I was before the crash and the person I was now. The difference was stark, and I knew I couldn't go back to who I had been. One of the first things I did after leaving the hospital was return to the church I had once mocked. It was small and unassuming, not unlike the one my mother used to take me to as a child. Sitting in the back pew, I closed my eyes and let the stillness wash over me. For the first time, I prayed, not out of obligation or desperation, but out of a deep and abiding need to connect with the one who had given me this second chance. Thank you, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Thank you for saving me, for showing me the truth. I don't deserve it, but I'm so grateful. The peace that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of struggle or pain, but the presence of something greater, something eternal. I felt held, seen, loved in a way that words could never capture. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. I mended relationships I had neglected, starting with Hannah. We spent hours talking, laughing, and simply being together, creating the bond one had long denied us. I reached out to colleagues, offering apologies to those I had wronged, and found unexpected grace in their forgiveness. I also returned to work, but not in the way I had before. The hospital had always been my sanctuary, my escape, but now it was something more, a place where I could truly serve, not just heal bodies, but touch souls. I took time to listen to my patients, to see them as more than cases or tasks to complete. It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard, but I was determined to live differently. One day, while walking through the hospital, I passed the waiting room where Mr. Daniels had once sat. The memory of him, of his grief, still haunted me, but it also reminded me of the ripple effects of my actions. I stopped and bowed my head, saying a silent prayer for him, for all the lives I had touched and would touch in the future. And then there was my faith. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a slow, steady growth, like a seed planted in fertile soil. I began attending church regularly, reading scripture, and seeking to understand the God who had shown me such unmerited grace. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew I never would, but I didn't need to. Faith wasn't about certainty, it was about trust, about surrender. One evening, I found myself in that same church, lighting a candle in memory of Eli. As the flame flickered, casting its soft glow on the walls, I thought of his words, his forgiveness, and the light in his eyes. Thank you, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, for not giving up on me. The flame burned steadily, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a reminder of the light I had seen in that otherworldly place. It was a light that now lived within me, guiding me, changing me, one step at a time. I wasn't perfect. I would never be perfect. But for the first time, I understood what it meant to truly live, not for myself, but for something greater, for him. And that was enough.